Do you own a DSLR but don't really know how to use it? We understand that the different options of a DSLR can be overwhelming. But don't worry, we have you covered. I'm Poonam Kateja from Pixel Activins and would like to welcome you to this masterclass. In today's topic, we will help you understand the 3 sections that explain how a digital camera works. Now let's discuss the exposure triangle. Shutter speed, aperture and ISO make up the 3 sides of an exposure triangle. They work together to produce a photo that is properly exposed. If one variable changes, at least one of the other must also change to maintain the correct exposure. This brings me to the first component of the exposure triangle, shutter speed. Now what is shutter speed? Shutter speed is the length of time that the camera shutter is open, exposing the light onto the camera sensor. Essentially, it's how long your camera spends taking a photo. This has a few important effects in how your images will appear. When you use a long shutter speed, you end up exposing your sensor for a significant period of time. The first big effect of it is motion blur. If your shutter speed is long, moving subjects in your photo will appear blurred along the direction of motion. This effect is used quite often in advertisements of cars and motorbikes, where a sense of speed and motion is communicated to the viewer by intentionally blurring the moving wheels. On the other hand, shutter speed can be used to do just the opposite, which is freeze motion. If you use a specially fast shutter speed, you can eliminate motion from fast-moving objects like birds in flight or cars driving past. Now, let me take you through how to set your shutter speed. Most cameras handle shutter speed automatically by default. When your camera is set to auto mode, the shutter speed is selected by the camera without your input, and so are your aperture and ISO. However, you can still set shutter speed manually if necessary. By setting the camera to shutter priority mode, you can choose the shutter speed and the camera automatically selects the aperture. By setting the camera to manual mode, you can choose both shutter speed and aperture manually. Now this brings us to the next component of the exposure triangle, which is the aperture. Now what is an aperture? Aperture can be defined as the opening in a lens through which light passes into the camera. It is an easy concept to understand if you think about how your eyes work. As you move between bright and dark environments, the iris in your eyes either expand or shrinks, controlling the size of your pupil. The same concept works with an aperture. But there's a catch. One important part of aperture that confuses beginning photographers more than anything else. This is something you really need to pay attention to and get it correct. The small numbers represent large openings, whereas the large numbers represent small apertures. Take a look at this chart. f2.8 is larger than f4 and much larger than f11. Most people find this awkward since we are used to having larger numbers represent larger values. Now how do you set your aperture in your camera? If you want to select your aperture manually in your camera for a photo, which is something we highly recommend, there are 2 modes which work: aperture priority mode and manual mode. Aperture priority mode is written as A or AV on most cameras, while manual mode is written as M. Usually, you can find these on the top dial of your camera. Now let's discuss the final component of the exposure triangle, ISO. Let's go through what is ISO in photography. In digital photography, the term ISO refers to the image sensor's sensitivity to light. The lower the number, the less sensitive the image sensor is to light. The higher the ISO, the more grainy an image becomes. This is why it's often not considered to be a good practice to only adjust the ISO in the absence of light. Most photographers, depending on the situation and their camera, will have to lower their shutter speed and aperture and raise the ISO to compensate for the absence of significant light source without making the image appear extremely grainy. An ISO of 100 is generally accepted as the standard ISO and will result in very crispy photographs with little or no grain. Most people tend to keep their digital camera set to auto, which allows the camera to select the most suitable ISO depending on the conditions in which they are shooting. The camera will try to keep the ISO as low as possible, as would a photographer when manually adjusting the settings. The scale on which the sensitivity is measured is 100, 200, 400 and so on, with a lower number indicating a lesser sensitivity to light. Quite simply, when you double your ISO, you're doubling the brightness of the photo. Hope you liked this video. Please rate us below and subscribe to be notified for the next class.